Thank you all very much. It's good to be with you, if only in this virtual format. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in Warsaw in these days, but teaching obligations in Rome at exactly this time make it impossible for me to join you. Nonetheless, I'm very grateful to the organizers for inviting me to offer some framing remarks for your conference based on its epigram, the text from St. John Paul II's 1995 address to the United Nations. And I hope what I have to say in these brief remarks will help set a useful and constructive framework for your deliberations. Let me begin by saying something about the context of that UN address in 1995 and why John Paul II decided to organize that address thematically the way he did. It was 6 years after the revolution of 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe. It was 4 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And there was a great debate on in the world about how had these epic events come to pass. Some were arguing that it was primarily because of the policies of Western powers, like the United States and Great Britain, and people of that cast of mind would point to President Reagan, Prime Minister Thatcher, perhaps including German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, as key figures in the revolution of 1989 and the Soviet crack-up of 1991. Still others argued that the crucial figure in all of this was Mikhail Gorbachev, a different kind of Soviet leader who, by refusing in the late 1980s to continue to impose Soviet hegemony in Central and Eastern Europe by force, created the condition for the possibility of the breakup of the Warsaw Pact and the end of the Cold War. Still others gave credit to the Helsinki Final Act of 1976, and particularly its human rights provisions and what that had launched behind the Iron Curtain and in the West in terms of Helsinki watch groups in the Warsaw Pact countries and their helpers, their parallel groups throughout Western Europe and North America. Still others said, look, this is all a matter of economics. Soviet economy was broken, couldn't possibly compete, and so forth and so on. John Paul II knew that there was an element of truth in each of those analyses, but he thought none of them drove the analysis deeply enough. And he made that quite clear in his 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus, when in reflecting on the revolution of 1989, he made it very clear that he understood that a revolution of conscience had preceded and made possible the political revolution of 1989 and the largely nonviolent collapse of European communism. He didn't say it in Centesimus Annus, but he well might have, that he had accelerated that revolution of conscience during his epic 9 days in Poland in June 1979. And in that sense, he was a pivotal, if not the pivotal figure in the decade that led up to the collapse of European communism. These were all points, I might add, that I had made in the 1992 book, The Final Revolution, The Resistance Church and the Collapse of Communism, which was the beginning of my personal and intense conversation with John Paul II, which continued until his death in 2005. So the Pope is going to go to the UN in October of 1995 with all of that in the background. A text was developed for his address to the UN by bureaucrats within the Vatican And a senior official of the Vatican Secretariat of State sent that text to me, that draft text, and asked me to comment on it. I read it and wrote him back, perhaps with less charity than I ought to have displayed, that it was a remarkably boring text and that it would put the entire United Nations General Assembly to sleep before the Pope had gotten through the first 3 paragraphs. And I proposed a different kind of text, a text that would stress the revolution of conscience that made possible the nonviolent collapse of communism, a text that would stress the priority of public moral culture, the priority of civil society for the future of freedom, not only in the new democracies, but in the established democracies of the world. I proposed, in other words, a text that would emphasize that freedom was not a free-floating capacity of choice, to use the word favored in many Western circles. Rather, freedom had a nobler quality, and the freedom that would make for decent human societies in the future was an ordered freedom or ordered liberty, freedom ordered to goodness, freedom tethered to truth. That, of course, raised the question, how do you deal with plurality? John Paul II was deeply aware that the world of the late 20th century was a world in which people in new democracies and old had very different ideas of things. What would transform that plurality, that fact of difference, into a genuine pluralism, an orderly debate about the human future that would make possible genuine democratic self-governance? Well, he thought that that kind of order, that kind of ordered liberty, that kind of ordered debate in civil society about the human future could be based on the moral truths accessible to everyone, because they were moral truths that we can know by reason. And that conviction entered the text of his 1995 UN address, which forms the epigram for your conference's reflections, where in that UN address, the Pope talks about the natural moral law as a grammar that can turn, if you will, cacophony into conversation, a grammar that can order the public debate on the human future in such a way that genuine solidarity can be achieved, even if that solidarity has to be built among people of different religious and political convictions, as indeed it must be throughout the world as it is. That grammar of public debate and conversation was a grammar, the Pope believed, in which freedom was ordered to truth, and especially the truth about the human person. The crucial factor in securing the human future was a public moral culture, he believed, that was rooted in fundamental truths about the human person. If we go back to that encyclical of 1991, Centesimus Annus, we see that he analyzes, John Paul II analyzes, the collapse of communism in terms of an anthropological crisis, anthropology in the philosophical sense of the term. Communism got the idea of the human person wrong, and that was why communism was going to fail at some point. A social system based on false ideas of the human person cannot sustain itself indefinitely over time. By the same token, and here is a point of caution that the Pope raised at the UN in 1995, a similar anthropological crisis, a similar crisis in the idea of the human person, could lead to the breakdown of solidarity within new democracies and old, and lead to the frustration of hopes for a freedom lived nobly in a post-Cold War world. That brings me to a third and final point. Where would this ordered liberty, where would this grammatically sensible public conversation about ordered liberty be nurtured in the free societies of the future? In John Paul II's view, that nurturing would take place primarily in civil society by a robust public moral culture shaped in part by a church that was a public church but not a partisan church. I think it's important in grasping the social doctrine of John Paul II to note that, like all of the popes of modernity, really from Pius IX on, John Paul II was skeptical about the capacities of the state, of the modern state, in the sphere of culture formation. He knew, as he made clear in the encyclical of 1995, Evangelium Vitae, when he spoke of a culture of death, he knew that the state could damage culture if the state raised manifest wrongs that we can know to be wrong by reason, into alleged rights. He knew that the state could damage the public moral culture. But he doubted that the state could build a culture of freedom lived nobly. That was, I think it's fair to say, in his view, beyond the capacity of the modern state. Building the culture of life, building a culture of freedom understood as tethered to truth and ordered to goodness, seemed to John Paul II the job of civil society and the job of the church. That was not primarily the job of the state. Of course, a rightly ordered state would create the space and would protect the space in which civil society and the church could do that job of building a robust public moral culture. But I think it's very doubtful that John Paul II would look to the state, the modern state, even the modern administrative state, as the primary engine of nurturing freedom lived nobly in the modern world, in the 21st century world. He would want the state to recognize the necessity of freedom lived nobly for its own good functioning. But he would not look primarily to the state. Rather, he would look to civil society and the church as a crucial actor in civil society to form that public moral culture that allows free politics and, I would add, free economics to function in such a way that the result is genuine human flourishing. Let me conclude by reading you the last paragraph of John Paul II's UN address in 1995. He said, "We must not be afraid of the future. We must not be afraid of man. It is no accident that we are here. Each and every human person has been created in the image and likeness of the one who is the origin of all that is. We have within us the capacities for wisdom and virtue. With these gifts and with the help of God's grace, we can build in the next century and the next millennium a civilization worthy of the human person, a true culture of freedom. We can and must do so. And in doing so, we shall see that the tears of this century have prepared the ground for a new springtime of the human spirit." Decades later, some might say that was naive. Perhaps it was. I would prefer, however, to think of that clarion call to freedom lived nobly, to think of it as a testimony of hope informed by faith. That is a faith and a hope the world badly needs today. That is a faith and hope the state cannot command, but that men and women living freedom nobly, living freedom in the truth, living in the truth, can nurture in their own lives and in the creation of a public culture of freedom lived nobly for the benefit of everyone. I wish you a good conference, and I thank you for your continued interest in John Paul II and all the important things that he has to say about the pursuit of freedom, solidarity, justice in the 21st century. Thank you.